The year approached the twilight of the 18th century, a period when the vast North American continent, particularly the jagged, snow-capped reaches of the high Rockies, still represented a true frontier. The rules of civilization yielded utterly to the immutable, patient laws of nature. Ki-no-ta, a hunter of the Blackfoot Nation, lay prone on the cooling earth, approximately 70 yards from a fast-moving tributary of the main river. He was a man of 22 seasons, trained since childhood to read the world in its most subtle, truthful language. His senses were his tools, sharp and reliable, and they told him that the world, though wild, was governed by a profound, if sometimes brutal, equilibrium. The air was heavy with the familiar, comforting smells of late summer transition, the dark, loamy scent of moist soil, the sharp medicinal aroma of crushed pine needles, the faint mineral tang of river water, and the distant, deep musk of the elk herd he had been tracking for 2 days. Every sound, the persistent, high-pitched whine of twilight insects, the gentle rustle of deer mice in the leaf litter, the conversational hoot of a great horned owl settling into the high branches, contributed to a predictable, understandable chorus. This was a place where knowledge meant survival, and Ki-no-ta knew his territory by heart. The violation of that sacred trust, the absolute end of the known world, commenced with a visual assault that transcended fire or weather. Far to the northeast, where the mountain spine defined the horizon, a savage, inaccessible line of fractured rock and ancient glacier, the sky began to reject the natural spectrum. It was not the brilliant, clean flash of a meteor burning out or the vivid, comforting orange of a raging wildfire. This luminescence was dull, deep, and thoroughly unnatural, a sickly, bruised shade that blended faint, phosphorescent green and a deep, malignant yellow. The hue was not generated within the atmosphere. It bled through from a massive cold void behind the structure of the sky itself. The light pulsed, slow and terrible, like the fevered, toxic heartbeat of an entity so colossal and remote that its mere presence warped local reality. It cast distorted, sickly shadows that stretched and warped the immediate terrain, twisting familiar bushes and trees into grotesque, alien shapes. The light was immediately succeeded by the absolute, aggressive cessation of sound. Ki-no-ta had never before encountered such an unnatural silence. It was not the mere absence of noise. It was a physical pressing vacuum. The moment the strange glow intensified, the complex symphony of the forest instantly vanished. Every insect, every nocturnal rodent, every distant predator, every breath of wind through the canopy, all stopped simultaneously, abruptly. The air instantly grew dense, heavy, and strangely cold, clamping down on Ki-no-ta's eardrums. The pressure felt like he had been pulled to the peak of the mountain in a single, painful instant. The entire world was suddenly muted, suffocated beneath an invisible, insulating force. He pressed his face hard against the cool, damp earth, straining to detect the smallest vibration of life, but found only the high-pitched, internal ringing caused by the immense pressure drop. The suffocating void left him feeling utterly exposed, stripped of the comforting sonic anonymity of the wild. The crushing silence was the prelude to the hum. It was a sound that did not require the ears to be heard. It was a profound, low-frequency resonance that bypassed the tympanic membrane entirely, traveling directly through the earth and into the solid architecture of Ki-no-ta's skeleton. He felt it vibrate painfully in his sternum, his jawbone, and the very soles of his feet. The source was not aerial. It was massive and subterranean. The deep, structural groan of the granite mountain itself. It was a heavy, labored exhalation that stretched beyond any natural sound barrier, communicating immense, crushing pressure. Ki no Ta felt a dizzying wave of nausea and disorientation. He knew the ground beneath him was not solid, but merely a thin, stressed crust over something impossibly vast and powerful that churned beneath. The hum was the sound of colossal weight displacing the deep earth. Finally, the thing itself became visible in its destructive path. The trajectory. The object that had previously generated the sickly light had dimmed, plunging through the final layers of atmosphere as a shapeless, colossal shadow. It was massive to the point of absurdity, a tumbling, immense presence that tore a path through the darkness toward a hidden, inaccessible gorge. This was no ephemeral cosmic debris. This was weight made manifest, a profound material consequence of sheer density, moving with a ponderous velocity that promised ground-shattering destruction. The object disappeared entirely behind the jagged western flank of the ridge, and its arrival was confirmed not by a brilliant explosion, but by a dull, terrifying seismic thud, a deep, earth-breaking groan that momentarily compressed the air and shuddered through the distant layers of stone. It was the sound of an ancient mountain protesting against an impossible imposition. Ki no Ta abandoned his hunt instantly, driven by a cold, primal compulsion that overwhelmed all caution and fear. He traveled the 5 miles toward the impact zone throughout the remainder of the night. He reached the site the following morning, illuminated by a pale, indifferent sun filtering through a dense, low layer of moisture-heavy cloud. The immediate environment did not show the typical scarring of a volatile fire. Instead, the trees, spruce and ancient cedar reaching over 100 feet high, were grotesquely twisted, snapped at the base, their colossal trunks thrown outward in precise radial lines, their bark scorched by a fierce, dry internal heat. The earth around the central scar was brittle, fissured and sickly gray, violently crushed and flash-heated by an immense internal force. The central scar itself defied categorization. It was not a deep, conical crater formed by an explosion. It was an enormous, slightly oval impression, a massive, shallow bruise in the earth, measuring nearly 50 yards in length. This was the mark of a landing, not an accident. Leading directly out of the center of that vast oval were the clear, definitive signs of the creature's movement. These were the tracks of the first fall, immense, disproportionately wide impressions, like the stamp of 4 colossal, rugged stone slabs. They showed 4 distinct points of contact, spread wide for maximum stability. The creature that made them had not walked in the manner of any known animal. It had imposed its monumental, crushing weight, forcing the moisture and soft soil out from beneath the structural arches of its foot. Ki no Ta, a hunter whose life depended on classifying every object in the natural world, felt his mind violently rejected the evidence. This was not a beast of bone or muscle. This was weight made manifest, an alien concept of mass that utterly defied the measured reality of the planet. He knew with sudden, paralyzing clarity that the equilibrium of his world had ended, replaced by an incomprehensible, terrifying imbalance that had just imprinted itself onto the geological structure of the mountain. Kai-no-ta approached the edge of the immense indentation left by the first fall with meticulous caution, the pulverized, gray earth grating beneath his worn hide boots. He knelt down, tracing the outline of the vast impression with a trembling finger. He observed a critical detail that spoke volumes about the nature of the entity. The soil inside the four-point outline was not merely compacted by vertical weight. It was unnaturally slick and polished in the center of the impression. The pressure exerted by the colossal weight had been so extreme, so uncompromising, that the minerals and moisture in the loam had been compressed into a density approaching smooth, yielding clay, resulting in a concave, polished surface. This was the clear stamp of structural, immense imposition, a sign that the creature's very existence utilized gravity as a focused, destructive tool, a mechanism designed to move massive loads with chilling efficiency. The hunter knew with sickening certainty that the creature's substance was impossibly dense. The air lingering over the impact zone was thick, heavy, and defined by a sharp, intolerable stench that burned the inside of Kai-no-ta's nostrils. It was a signature unique to the non-organic invader, a chemical assault that violently rejected the familiar odors of the forest. The primary notes were the searing, nose-tingling aroma of ozone, the intense electrical charge that saturates the air just before a catastrophic lightning strike, intermixed with the pungent, coppery, oxidized tang of iron. Beneath these familiar chemical markers was a third, utterly alien component, a deep mineral acridity like sulfurous stone dust and heavy burnt quartz. It was the smell of a vast ancient machine, utterly devoid of the warmth or life of organic matter. This anti-organic odor clung tenaciously to Kai-no-ta's tunic, hair, and throat, actively rejecting the clean, earthy sense of the surrounding wilderness. The heat emanating from the crater's epicenter was dry, profound, and relentlessly consistent. It radiated outwards in powerful, palpable waves that warmed the hunter's face even from 20 yards away. There was no visible smoke, no residual steam or crackling sound, nothing to indicate volatile combustion. This was heat generated by an internal, ancient engine, energy released by a colossal power source that metabolized rock and mineral, not the fragile sustenance of wood or flesh. Kai-no-ta felt a chilling fear that transcended the simple terror of fire. It was the cold, intellectual dread of confronting an indifferent, unliving force, a machine of impossible density that treated the planet itself as raw material. The dry heat pressed against his skin, pushing him away from the source of the inexplicable power. The massive, four-pointed tracks of the first fall led directly away from the crater's edge. They did not meander or explore. They cut a straight, unrelenting line across the terrain, crushing small saplings and displacing tons of loose earth with chilling efficiency. The path followed the most challenging and inaccessible geography, aiming precisely for the highest, most ancient granite faces of the mountain range. This was not a creature fleeing or searching for prey. It was a creature returning, marching with the certainty of a compass needle toward a specific, preordained sanctuary deep within the geological structure of the earth. The weight of the creature was such that it momentarily shifted the small stones and pebbles in its path, creating a persistent, low friction sound that the hunter still faintly detected. Kai-no-ta was meticulously documenting the line of destruction in his memory, struggling to reconcile the existence of this silent behemoth with the immediate need to warn his people. when he felt a sudden, sharp internal pressure drop, accompanied by a rapid, metallic ringing sensation that pierced his ears. He glanced up, his gaze drawn by an unnatural disturbance in the pale sky. The heavens were violently interrupted. The second object was startlingly smaller than the first, the combined mass of 3 large bison, and its trajectory was terrifyingly chaotic and fast. It entered the atmosphere at a viciously steep, unstable angle, trailing not a clean, fiery comet's tail, but a fluctuating, noxious ribbon of vapor, sickly green and violently unstable, tearing and fracturing behind it like burning, tattered canvas. The sound of the second fall was the precise and agonizing antithesis of the regulator's arrival. Where the heavy one had arrived with a deep, subsonic groan, this object sliced through the air with a piercing, high-pitched shriek. It was a raw, visceral sound like immense metal scraping against metal at catastrophic velocity, instantly mixed with a high, agonized wail, a sound that was both animal and desperate, full of terror and catastrophic kinetic energy. It was the unbearable noise of something alive and terrified being violently scraped against the planet's unyielding protective shell. The smaller object impacted less than a mile away, plunging into a dense, steep-sided ravine. The sound was a loud, messy, splintering crash, accompanied by the tearing, snapping noise of high timber giving way. Kinota stood frozen, breathing the acrid chemical air left by the atmospheric friction. The profound differences between the two arrivals were too stark to ignore. The first, heavy, silent, and geological. The second, chaotic, screaming, and desperately biological. These were not random cosmic events. These were two components of a single, terrible emerging system, and their immediate relationship was defined by catastrophic hostility. The ancient equilibrium had not merely been violated. It was being replaced by a horrifying alien hierarchy that had just delivered its first chaotic spawn onto the quiet surface of the world. Kinota knew that the second fall was the inevitable biological consequence of a deeper, unknown process. Kinota approached the ravine with meticulous caution, using the dense, low-hanging canopy of spruce and hemlock as cover. The heavy mineral scent of the first fall still clung to his clothes, but now it was overlaid with a new, biological rankness. The acrid, unsettling smell of ozone mixed with scorched, spoiled meat. He was determined to observe the survivors of the chaotic second fall. The scene at the site of the impact, half a mile away, lacked the massive structural damage left by the regulator. Here the horror was subtle, rooted in a profound biological corruption. The earth around the impact point was soaked with a thin, iridescent, unnaturally sickly green slime, mixed with sticky fragments of scorched, melted organic material. The residue of a life form catastrophically disintegrated upon atmospheric entry. The viscous slime coated the low-lying rocks and ferns, refusing to evaporate or dissipate. The surrounding vegetation bore the immediate mark of a devastating ecological sickness. The healthy, vibrant green of the forest floor already yielded to rapid, catastrophic decay. Fresh leaves on the low-lying mountain laurel and wild huckleberry bushes turned a frantic, unnatural yellow and instantly wilted, as if a profound, invisible biological poison had been instantaneously injected into their root systems. A brown fungal blight spread visibly across the lichen clinging to the granite outcrops, and the very air felt heavy and toxic, as though the life essence, the anima of the plant world, had been violently sucked out by the impact, leaving behind a husk of rapid decomposition that defied the natural pace of the seasons. Ki no Ta found the tracks of the survivors. They were numerous, flexible, and utterly predatory, fanning out wildly from the immediate impact zone, suggesting frantic, desperate movement driven by pure terror. They were fundamentally different from the tracks of any known terrestrial animal. While they possessed the basic canine structure, 4 toes and a heel pad, the proportions were grotesquely wrong. The heel pad was abnormally wide, almost human in its mass and size, and the claws were excessively long, thin, and acutely sharp, digging into the soft loam not as dull shovels, but as separate, pointed spikes designed to find purchase on rough terrain. The prince spoke of immense, agile strength coupled with a chaotic, desperate velocity, far exceeding the speed of a mountain lion or a grizzly bear. As the heavy, cold cloak of twilight began its inevitable descent, Ki no Ta experienced the full, profound psychological weight of the new reality. The deep forest, which for millennia had sung an endless, complex symphony of nighttime sounds, the chirping of unseen things, the distant howls of wolves, the high shriek of a bobcat, was now locked in an absolute physical vacuum. The silence was not passive. It was an aggressive, terrifying force. No cricket chirped, no branch creaked under the weight of a resting bird. No nocturnal mouse rustled through the leaf litter. It was total, profound quiet. The air felt suddenly pressurized and thick, filled with heavy, sound-absorbing wool that actively clamped down on his inner ear. The resulting high-pitched ringing in his skull was the only noise. In this oppressive vacuum, every action Ki no Ta took felt deafeningly loud, a betrayal of his primal need for stealth. The slow, careful placement of his foot on a patch of dry pine needles was the sound of a pistol shot. The friction of his coarse hide clothing against a granite rock seemed criminally loud. He was instantly stripped of the natural camouflage of ambient noise, exposed and acutely vulnerable in a world where sound itself was a commodity stolen by some unseen, overwhelming presence that was now closing in. The unnerving quiet amplified his own rising internal panic to a screaming volume. Yet deep beneath the stone, in time with the erratic thrumming of his racing pulse, the low seismic vibration returned. It was the hum from the day before, the methodical, constant pulse of the first fall, the regulator. It was moving, slowly but purposefully, traversing the deep substructure of the mountain, following the ancient pathways of the bedrock. The regulator was closing the distance drawn by the very chaos and biological imbalance the second fall had caused. Its movement was not a search. It was an inevitable convergence, the mechanism responding to the rising pressure of contamination. Suddenly, violently, the absolute silence was ripped apart. It was a sound utterly foreign and abhorrent to the wilderness. A high-pitched, gargling scream, followed immediately by a thick, rattling, guttural roar. The noise was unnatural, agonizingly loud in the sound vacuum, a horrifying composite of bestial, untamed rage and the unmistakable, desperate inflection of human agony and surprise. It was too complex, too intelligent for any known predator, yet too violent for any human throat. It communicated chaos given a voice, and it was close, perhaps a quarter-mile down the ravine, beyond a screen of heavy timber. Ki no Ta instantly knew that the survivors of the second fall had just encountered the existing life of the mountain, and the terrifying hierarchy of this new corrupt world was about to be violently established. Ki no Ta moved to the high edge of the ravine, where the fragmented shadows of the ancient rock outcroppings afforded the best cover. He slid along the cracked granite lip, utilizing the patient, seamless skill of a man who had spent his life dissolving into the landscape. He moved with a singular focus, his hunter's instinct demanding that he observe the source of the terrible sound. Survival was contingent on understanding the capabilities of the newly arrived chaos. His position, high on the western side of the deep cut, gave him an unobstructed, though deeply unsettling view of the narrow valley floor below, where the unnatural noises continued, a sequence of thick, wet, tearing sounds interspersed with ragged snarls. He found them in a tangled, murky depression, a small clearing where the dense undergrowth reluctantly yielded to soft, boggy earth. The illumination here was minimal, a diffuse, sickly wash from the hidden moon, struggling to pierce the heavy layer of charcoal clouds. But the sight was unmistakable and profoundly wrong. There were two immense figures, monstrously misshapen and utterly devoid of natural symmetry. They moved with a jerky, spasmodic velocity, a gait that was far too quick and powerful for a man, yet awkward and structurally unsound for a true beast. They were locked in a horrific, ravenous activity, tearing at something large on the ground. These were the first of the creatures he mentally designated as the lupuses, the surviving spawn of the second fall. Their anatomy was an abomination, a terrifying, failed synthesis of man and beast. They easily stood over 7 feet tall, reaching closer to 8 feet when they momentarily stretched upright in their frenzy, their bulk distributed over thick, hunched shoulders. Their limbs were disproportionately long, especially their arms, which hung nearly to their knees and ended in colossal, spiked hands. The head was immense, heavily bestial, yet the underlying structure spoke of a recent violent metamorphosis from a fundamentally human shape. They were neither fully bipedal nor true quadrupeds, moving with a confusing, desperate athleticism, driven by a profound, restless energy. The object of their fury was the remains of a magnificent mountain elk, which they had clearly intercepted and killed and were now tearing apart. But this was not a hunt for sustenance driven by clean need. The violence was excessive, wasteful, and driven by a primal, unrestrained fury. Chunks of hide, muscle, and splintered bone, still steaming slightly in the cold night air, were ripped away and tossed contemptuously into the surrounding ferns, driven not by the calculated hunger of a wolf, but by an excessive, maniacal rage. It was a scene of chaos and profound, unnecessary gluttony, a hunger that was rooted not in physical need, but in a monstrous internal dissatisfaction that no amount of consumption could quell. The lupuses were consuming out of a destructive compulsion. Ki no Ta forced his gaze to their faces. When the pale, diffuse moonlight caught their eyes, they reflected a terrifying liquid yellow fire. There was no reflection of rational thought, no flicker of planning or intelligence. Only pure, primal, predatory need, magnified and powered by an almost human reservoir of strength and desperation. They communicated only through ragged snarls and the agonizing hybrid screams Ki no Ta had heard, a sound that resonated with the violence of the wolf, and the profound moral confusion of a man trapped within a terrifying broken shell. They were caught in an endless loop of pain and violence, incapable of finding peace. The odor rising from the valley floor was overwhelming, a thick, nauseating pall that clung heavily to the cold air. It was a searing blend of raw, metallic blood and thick, hot animal musk, overlaid with the rank, spoiled scent of deep earth and a strong, sickly chemical stench like rancid vegetable oil mixed with human sweat. It was the biological signature of fever, unchecked aggression, and deep, rapid biological corruption. The scent profile was entirely wrong for the deep woods, a profound offense to the natural order. Watching their senseless, hyper-violent activity, Ki no Ta grasped the devastating truth of their existence. These lupuses, the spawn of the second fall, were an ecological malignancy. They were the result of a chaotic, mutagenic impact, genetically programmed for rapid reproduction and killing with an unrestrained zeal that guaranteed the quick destruction of the local prey populations. They were the ultimate biological imbalance, created in an instant and capable of overwhelming and consuming the territory. He knew with a paralyzing certainty that their very existence demanded a swift, total, and terrible correction, and he felt the growing vibration of that correction already closing in beneath the stone. The chaos had taken its first definitive, destructive form, and it was ready to multiply. While the two massive lupuses continued their brutal and utterly chaotic dismantling of the elk carcass, a frenzy of tearing claws and guttural hybrid snarls, the rhythmic low tremor that had been a dull background pulse suddenly intensified to a terrifying degree. The earth beneath Ki no Ta's high vantage point began to vibrate with a powerful, consistent shudder, resonating violently through his boots and up into his jaw, momentarily drowning out the noise of the lupus's frantic feeding. It was the close approach of the heavy one, the creature of the first fall, and its movement was now purposeful, rapid, and singularly focused on the source of the biological chaos. The mechanism was arriving. Approximately 300 yards down the ravine, where the shadows of the ancient trees were deepest and most tangled, the darkness physically coalesced and compressed. Then, the object stepped forward. Its emergence was not the silent, fluid motion of a predator slipping out from behind a tree line. It was the heavy, inevitable, terrible appearance of something that had simply finished separating itself from the very composition of the deep earth. It moved with the overwhelming certainty of something obeying a deep geological mandate, a force of nature given terrible form. The regulator, the colossal entity of the first fall, was fully visible on the edge of the clearing. Its height was monumental, easily exceeding 8 feet, and its width and bulk were staggering, the weight distributed over thick, short limbs that seemed incapable of supporting such immense mass. Its form was encased in a massive plated carapace that resembled solidified, decaying limestone, mottled in deep, sickly green and black, appearing less like skin and more like a rough-hewn statue animated by some powerful internal engine. It possessed no discernible neck. The blunt, immense head was set directly into the sloping shoulders, giving it the aspect of a walking geological formation, utterly rigid and unyielding. The eyes of the regulator were set deep within the heavy, mineralized brow, recessed so far back that they should have been invisible in the gloom. Yet they burned with a constant, unblinking yellow light, like the dull, contained heat of smoldering sulfur or an overheated engine coil. In that terrifying gaze there was no sign of rage, fear, or hunger, only a profound Arctic cold surgical concentration. It was observing the chaotic scene with the absolute impartiality of a natural law being enforced. The sound of its movement was not footsteps in the organic sense. It was a deep, dry grating, a slow, ponderous scrape, like a 1,000-ton block of rough-cut granite being dragged across wet gravel. It was the sound of terrible metallic friction, a profound protest against the yielding earth. The regulator carried the combined heavy stench of the crash site, the mineral tang, the dampness of deep earth, and a potent, sulfurous chemical aroma that suffocated the natural air. The smell was the signature of its fundamental alien nature. The two lupuses, caught mid-snarl, froze absolutely in their tracks. Their aggressive feeding ceased instantly, and the raw pieces of elk meat fell forgotten from their claws. Their yellow eyes, minutes before blazing with manic hunger, were now wide with an absolute crushing terror. They looked at the regulator as a superior, incomprehensible force that had just rewritten the terrifying laws of their existence. The deep, animalistic fear radiating from them was palpable. They recognized in that paralyzing moment that they were no longer the apex of the chaos. They were merely the designated contamination, the inevitable prey of the correction mechanism. The regulator halted 30 yards from the carnage. It did not snarl, roar, or display any sign of aggression. It stood utterly motionless, a vast, silent, immovable statue of calcified mineral and raw weight. In this terrible stillness, Kinota sensed not patience, but the boundless, chilling certainty of its preordained purpose. It was the mechanism, activated by the critical mass of biological chaos, waiting with profound confidence for the optimal, calculated moment to initiate its work. The cull had begun, and the regulator was the terrifying instrument of the Earth's defense. Its arrival was the ultimate judgment on the chaotic spawn of the second fall. The silence, stretched taut between the frantic terror of the lupuses and the cold stillness of the regulator, held for only a few agonizing seconds. Then, the larger and more reckless of the two lupuses, unable to bear the psychological pressure of the regulator's relentless stillness, made its final, fatal move. Driven by a desperate surge of panic and animal rage, it launched itself forward with a terrifying, ragged scream. Its long, spiked claws were aimed at the massive shoulder of the regulator, targeting the area where a neck might have been, hoping to find a vulnerability in the seemingly endless armor. The regulator did not evade, flinch, or block the attack. It simply absorbed the blow. Kainota heard a high, sickening screech, the sound of sharp, organic weapons failing utterly and violently against an impenetrable surface. The lupus's powerful claws merely skidded across the dense, layered plating of the regulator's skin, leaving no mark, failing even to disrupt the immense creature's terrifying posture. The mineralized armor had rendered the lupus's primary weapon useless against the fundamental density of the mechanism. The creature's defense was its very composition. The regulator's retaliation was instantaneous and wholly devoid of any emotion or physical effort. One of its colossal four-fingered hands, ending in thick, blunt, rock-like claws, shot out. It closed over the torso of the attacking lupus with a terrifying speed that defied the creature's sheer size. The strength exerted was beyond terrestrial comprehension, easily dwarfing the massive power of the wolf creature, whose massive muscles instantly yielded to the immense pressure. A sickening sequence followed. There was a loud, sharp snap, like a heavy, dry limb being broken over an anvil, signifying the catastrophic failure of the lupus's entire skeletal structure. This was immediately followed by a profound, wet, sucking, compressing noise. The sound of vital fluids and air being violently expelled from the body by impossible hydrostatic pressure. The lupus hung limply in the creature's grip, its limbs instantly slack and grotesquely twisted, its life extinguished in a single brutal moment of total compression. The regulator, with an indifferent, dismissive gesture, dropped the inert, broken form onto the wet earth. It did not pause to examine or process the kill. It simply transferred its cold focus to the second lupus, moving toward it with the slow, deliberate measure of a heavy, precise machine. Its entire posture communicated not the fury of a predator, but the profound, surgical focus of a functionary assigned to a deeply unpleasant, yet absolutely necessary task. The second lupus, momentarily paralyzed by the instantaneous, terrifying demise of its mate, scrambled backward, attempting to use the minimal human cunning it retained to find a hiding place in the dense shadow of the ravine wall. It moved with frantic, desperate velocity, but the regulator did not engage in a chase. It merely placed its monumental body between the lupus and the desired escape route, blocking the entire width of the narrow depression with its overwhelming mass. Then, with a sudden, unnerving burst of calculated speed that was utterly incompatible with its size, it swept one massive hand forward and crushed the mutant's spine against the nearest granite outcrop. The sound was a quick, dull crack. Kainota, watching from above, felt the true chilling depth of the scene sink in. This was not a clash of apex predators. It was an act of brutal, systematic eradication. The regulator was operating under a strict, unforgiving, and ancient mandate. It was a physical function deployed specifically to eliminate the chaos and uncontrolled proliferation caused by the second fall. The lupuses were not merely food. They were a biological contaminant, a weed that required immediate, efficient removal from the deep soil of the planet. The correction was absolute. The two primary lupuses had been eliminated with the casual ease of snapping dry twigs, reduced to shattered masses. But a third creature, smaller, more sinewy, and possessed of a hyper-developed cunning, had remained hidden deep within the high ferns, waiting for an opportune moment. As the regulator turned its immense attention to the crushed remains, preparing to begin its strange processing ritual, the third lupus saw its final desperate opportunity. It launched itself from the shadow, its sharp specialized claws aimed not at the massive armored front, but at the rear of the regulator's lower leg, just above the ankle, hoping to penetrate a perceived weak point in the mineralized plating. The attack was delivered with the concentrated force of a creature fighting for the survival of its species. The claws plunged deep, finding a fleeting weakness in the layered mineralized hide. For the first time since its arrival, the regulator recoiled violently. Its colossal weight shifted abruptly, throwing the creature momentarily off balance, and the immense form lurched with an audible, heavy grating sound. The ground shook violently beneath the sudden, uncontrolled movement of the immense mass. From the deep, penetrating wound, A torrent of viscous, dark liquid erupted. The fluid was a terrifying, profoundly alien substance, not blood in any organic terrestrial sense, but a thick, glossy black fluid, heavy and pressurized like ancient oxidized tar. It possessed a sharp, intensely chemical odor, a profound mix of industrial solvent and raw sulfur, the vital essence of the mechanism now catastrophically leaking onto the cold earth. It was the creature's lifeblood, and it was non-biological. For a chilling moment, the regulator became utterly still, paralyzed by the injury. It emitted a sound that bypassed Ki no Ta's ears and resonated deep in his chest. A low, grinding, heavy shudder, like a vast mechanical system suffering a major internal failure. It was a metallic, seismic protest that communicated genuine, profound internal distress. The sudden agonizing pause represented a profound sign of vulnerability, a momentary lapse in its otherwise terrifying, relentless efficiency. The period of vulnerability was brief, lasting 4 terrifying seconds. The paralysis was all the third lupus needed to attempt an escape, darting away from the immediate scene. But as the creature tried to flee, the regulator violently rotated its immense torso. The movement was jarring and rapid. Its massive leg descended upon the smaller lupus. There was no struggle, no sound of rage, only the catastrophic compression as the vast, overwhelming weight turned the escaping mutant into a smear of raw, liquid matter against the unyielding stone. The regulator stood over the pulverized remains, its dull yellow eyes flickering erratically, its breathing now heavy and wet, a rasping wheeze that carried the sharp scent of the black fluid. Then it slowly lowered its head, opening its vast, square mouth. Its jaw was lined with thick, curving plates designed for pulverizing hard material, not tearing soft flesh. It began to absorb the remains. Ki no Ta watched the slow, horrifying process. It was not a meal in the traditional hunting sense. It was processing. The regulator extracted essential elements, minerals or raw necessary energy, from the crushed remains, eliminating the biological hazard while replenishing its own unique, terrifying power source. The hunter understood a fundamental truth. The creature was not immortal, but its vulnerability was confined to a strange, volatile chemical biology, a weakness that was quickly being self-corrected by its inherent geological resilience. The leak of the thick black fluid confirmed that the regulator was a self-sustaining entity, but one that could be harmed, however briefly, by sharp, focused violence. The realization added a new, terrifying dimension to the conflict. When the processing ritual was finally complete, the ravine floor was heavy with the stench of the black chemical tar, the metallic tang of ozone, and the lingering sulfurous breath of the regulator. The monster stood motionless, its immense body coated in mud and the sticky, dark residues of the lupuses. Its movements, though still governed by colossal weight, had regained their methodical, chilling purpose. The mechanical shuddering had subsided, replaced by a deep, powerful stillness. Then the immense necklace head rotated. It turned slowly, laboriously, sweeping across the perimeter of the ravine with an unnerving mechanical deliberation. Ki no Ta, pressed flat against the cold, damp granite of his hideout, felt the very moment the creature's dull yellow gaze locked onto his precise sheltered location. The sheer power of its focused attention was a physical weight against his chest. The hunter froze, all breath caught in his lungs. His heart hammered against his ribs with a frantic internal drumming that seemed loud enough to betray him further to the massive entity. This was the moment of absolute total exposure, discovered by a being that defied all known natural order. A creature that had just demonstrated the power to extinguish life with the casual force of a falling stone. Kinota braced himself for the immediate crushing attack he knew he deserved for witnessing the unwatchable. Yet the regulator did not rush forward. It did not emit a roar of triumph or display any sign of predatory excitement. It simply stared. Its gaze was prolonged, arctic cold and intensely analytical, the scrutiny of a massive automated scanner observing an interesting yet ultimately insignificant speck of dust. The creature was calculating, not pursuing. In that chilling, impassive stare, Kinota grasped the terrible reality of his position. He, the man, was not part of the regulator's operational parameters. Human beings with their defined territories, their relatively slow reproductive cycles, and their limited ability to disrupt the deep geological or biological balance of the mountain were currently not a threat. Humanity was, in the regulator's ancient, indifferent calculation, utterly irrelevant. His own life was spared not by stealth or luck, but by his species' failure to yet cross the threshold of destructive, unmanageable imbalance. He was safe because he did not matter. The regulator eventually lowered its massive head, acknowledging the hunter's presence only with that cold, assessing stare. Then, without a sound, save for the deep, dry grating of its mass against the crushed earth, it turned its immense bulk and began its long, deliberate march away from the carnage. It walked toward the high, rock-strewn crest, disappearing into the deepest shadows of the ridges, moving with the heavy certainty of something returning to its intended deep, stony sanctuary. The regulator was the mechanism, the ultimate watchman of stone, and it only focused on the variables that mattered. Kinota waited until the very last faint seismic vibration had died from the soles of his feet. He finally uncurled his stiff body and emerged from his cramped hiding place. He stood amidst the broken, pulverized remains, surrounded by the physical evidence of the systematic cleansing. His survival was a product of the regulator's terrifyingly narrow focus, a profound reprieve based entirely on the fleeting insignificance of his kind. He knew, however, that he was now carrying a dangerous, terrifying knowledge, a truth that could not be shared, but which must be protected. The regulator had spared him, but the fear had irrevocably altered him. Kinota spent the early hours of the following morning traversing the vast and terrible aftermath of the encounter, his hunter's instincts forcing him to meticulously document the horror that his human comprehension struggled to accept. He noted that the black, tar-like fluid that had leaked from the regulator's wound had almost instantly begun to crystallize. Exposed to the cold, damp morning air, it had formed solid, glossy, mineralized nodules, a stark testament to the creature's non-organic chemical composition and its rapid internal ability to self-seal. The creature was capable of repairing itself with geological speed. He followed the massive, four-pointed track of the regulator as it led toward the high ground. The tracks ended abruptly and definitively at a deep, ancient vertical fissure in the rock face, a narrow, darkened slit that seemed to have been surgically cut into the massive granite wall. The crevice looked natural, yet it was perfectly adapted for a vertical descent, an entrance that blended seamlessly with the oldest geology of the range. The mechanism had simply walked back into the core of the mountain. Nearby, Kainota found the faint familiar marks of indigenous wildlife, old deer trails and beaver paths almost swallowed by the dense growth. But superimposed upon these were the numerous newer flexible prints of the lupuses. These tracks did not lead toward the rock fissure. They radiated outward, fanning violently across the terrain, heading into the distant valleys and lower, heavily forested slopes. The pattern was chaotic and desperate. The hunter realized that the regulator's cull, though brutally efficient in the immediate confrontation, had not achieved total elimination. The massive, focused attack had not eliminated the threat. It had violently dispersed it. The surviving lupuses, given a horrific, unforgettable lesson in the consequences of localized density, had fled, scattering to establish new, isolated territories. The chaos had been scattered, destined to create hidden pockets of imbalance far beyond the immediate, slow patrol range of the mechanism. The threat had simply decentralized. The regulator, for all its colossal power, was fundamentally limited by its reliance on heavy seismic movement and its focused, deliberate purpose. It was an excellent tool for removing dense concentrations, but it was incapable of policing the entire vast territory simultaneously. The lupuses were now primed to become an insidious, decentralized, and metastasizing threat, ready to multiply in secret and slowly undermine the ecosystem from within. Their chaotic nature made them hard to catch. In his meticulous examination of the regulator's point of entry into the sheer rock face, Kainota discovered the most chilling evidence of the creature's relationship with its environment. High up on the unforgiving granite, far above the reach of any man, he noticed a deep, vertical scar. It was not a natural fracture caused by weathering. It was a long, clean furrow, perfectly straight, resembling the track a colossal, blunt spike would leave if dragged across the hard stone surface. The groove ran upward, disappearing into the blackness of the crevice. He realized the terrifying implication. The regulator did not merely use the mountain. It resided within it, using the internal structure of the rock itself as its habitat and its network. The creature utilized its immense strength and mass to find purchase in the unforgiving stone, moving through the deep geological pathways of the mountains as easily as a man walks along a well-worn trail. The regulator's presence was not temporary or accidental. It was profound, ancient, and intrinsically woven into the very geography of fear, a latent force waiting beneath the surface of the world. Kainota eventually returned to his secluded camp, his hunting pouch heavy not with sustenance, but with the terrifying artifacts of a shattered world. He carried desiccated, yellowing scraps of vegetation from the second fall site, several pieces of the hard, mineralized tar, and, most disturbingly, small clumps of lupus hair that still smelled intensely of fever and disease. His mind, once so anchored to the predictable cycles of the seasons, was now consumed by an impossible, alien calculus that redefined his understanding of life and death. He struggled incessantly to find a logical connection between the two arrivals. The first fall, heavy, mineralized, a creature of ancient, controlling mass. The second fall, light, biological, chaotic, and aggressively reproductive. It was not a simple predator-prey relationship. It was a deliberate, horrifying process of reaction and correction, The biological chaos was instantly answered by the geological correction. It was an environmental war between proliferation and containment, and the deep earth was the stage for this catastrophic drama that human history was entirely unaware of. His sensory perception remained violently altered. The familiar, comforting world of scents and sounds had disappeared. He now perceived only two fundamental opposing forces operating in the world: the blind, consuming energy of chaos, which sought only rapid, unchecked growth, and the cold, unfeeling mechanism, which sought to impose an eternal, brutal equilibrium upon the landscape. The duality was absolute. A profound, gnawing fear took root. If the lupuses were the result of a powerful, mutagenic force, their rapid population recovery was guaranteed despite their dispersal. The regulator, moving slowly and methodically, was only capable of reacting to concentrations of the threat. It could not patrol every hidden valley. The danger had not been eliminated. It had been deferred, scattered, and was now metastasizing throughout the entire region, slowly poisoning the ecosystem. Ki no Ta looked down at the physical evidence he had collected, the proof of an unimaginable reality. He knew with absolute certainty that he could not share this truth with his tribe. To speak of a creature that walks out of the stone, or of men whose forms were violently warped into monstrous bestial shapes, would be met with scorn, panic, and the complete destruction of his authority. The human mind's need for rational order was too strong to accept this cosmic horror. It rejected the truth outright. He made a terrible, solitary decision. The evidence must be utterly destroyed. He had to erase all physical proof and preserve the knowledge only as a terrifying, unspoken secret, a truth to be passed down through the most careful, subtle alterations of tribal lore. He had to construct a powerful shield of myth and taboo around the horrifying fact to protect his people from the knowledge itself. He built a small, isolated fire and began to burn the biological samples. The lupus hair did not burn cleanly or with the smoke of normal flesh. It hissed, curled violently, and released a thin, sickening, greenish-yellow vapor that hugged the ground, smelling intensely chemical and toxic, utterly alien to the smoke of any natural animal. He carefully pulverized the pieces of mineralized tar and scattered the dust to the wind, watching as the chemical residue vanished into the damp earth. He knew that the sight he had witnessed, the regulator and the lupuses, was an event of such profound geological horror that it could not be allowed to contaminate the common history of man. It had to remain hidden in the shadows of myth. Several seasons had cycled into deep years since the night of the two falls. Ki no Ta, now regarded as a man of profound wisdom and increasingly eccentric habits, carried the heavy knowledge of the mechanism and the chaos. The world was fundamentally altered to him, no longer a comfortable sanctuary, but a place where a terrifying, unseen war was constantly being fought beneath the veneer of familiar reality. The immediate shock had faded, replaced by a constant low-level dread, a perpetual anxiety that prevented him from ever truly resting. He began to observe the long-term ecological consequences in the peripheral forests, deep within the territory. The results were chilling and confirmed his worst fears about the scattered lupus population. In the valleys and low-lying hunting grounds where the ecosystem should have been thriving, the environment was eerily sterile. Deer, elk, and small ground-dwelling game became profoundly scarce, vanishing as if driven out by a localized, concentrated terror. The complex food chain fractured under an invisible, overwhelming stress, a localized overpredation that defied the normal capacity of native hunters. In those same regions, Ki no Ta found the remains of native predators. They were the victims of a profound, unnatural violence. Wolves, lynx, and even a massive, mature black bear had met their fates. They were not hunted cleanly for food. Their bodies were simply destroyed, broken, and torn with a shocking, unnecessary savagery. Limbs were snapped, internal organs scattered haphazardly, the entire scene communicating a clear signature of unchecked rage and territorial aggression. This was the precise hunting method of the lupus. Not a clean kill for sustenance, but a savage, relentless removal of all competition from their newly established pockets of chaos. This was the terrible cost of the dispersed imbalance. Ki no Ta found that his own sensory perception remained violently altered, a permanent side effect of his exposure. He lived in a state of sensory overload. Sounds, the sharp call of a hawk, the distant rush of a waterfall, were now painfully acute, assaulting his inner ear with overwhelming clarity. Scents were unbearably vivid, the musks of the forest animals too thick, too pungent. He moved through the world with a permanent headache, a persistent, low-grade buzzing beneath his skin that was a constant reminder of his close brush with the edge of the system. He now understood his terrible, lifelong responsibility. He began to shape new social boundaries and ancient-sounding taboos for his people, carefully weaving the cold truth into layers of protective superstition. He warned the younger hunters with increasing severity. Never venture to the high peaks where the air is too still and the birds refuse to fly. If you hear the cry of a beast that sounds as if a man's pain has been turned into a scream of boundless fury, flee instantly and never look back. The warnings were designed to keep the tribe's population and impact low, away from the regulator's notice. He realized that his tribe, any growing human population, was just another variable in the regulator's chilling equation. If their numbers grew too great, if their encroachment on the territory became too destructive, or if they accidentally stumbled into the chaotic reproductive cycle of the lupuses, they too quickly crossed the threshold of attention, becoming a target for the chilling intervention of the mechanism. He looked out across the land where his people lived and saw only a temporary reprieve. Decades passed, folding into the long, slow march of the centuries. Ki no Ta eventually passed away, but his knowledge persisted, transmuted into the deep-seated lore and warnings of his descendants. The man who had witnessed the two falls became the source of a powerful, cryptic oral tradition. The world outwardly seemed to have reclaimed its harmony, but the careful observer, those who lived by Ki no Ta's warnings, knew the calm was merely the prelude to the next catastrophic act. Occasionally, usually when the air was cold and dry and the wind blew hard from the cold, high peaks, a faint, metallic scent permeated the valleys. It was the sharp, mineralized, sulfurous aroma, a distant subterranean exhalation of the mechanism, a faint, chilling reminder of its constant presence, perpetually cycling through the immense, stony heart of the mountain. It was the sleeping breath of the regulator. The legends he had painstakingly crafted had become the unquestioned truth of the tribe. The lupuses were the shadow men, creatures of chaos and destructive hunger, always to be avoided at the cost of life. The regulator was the Stone Watchman, a profound, ancient entity that rose from the rock only when the Shadow Men grew too numerous and their violence became too great. The myths provided a vital psychological buffer, transforming the incomprehensible horror into a manageable moralistic narrative that his people endured without succumbing to madness. Kinota's final profound understanding, the seed of the truth that was passed down, was that the regulator was not an arbitrary invader or a figure of folklore. It was an autonomous geobiological system, the ultimate mechanism of self-regulation embedded within the planet, activated whenever the biological or ecological systems failed and threatened the deep, ancient equilibrium of the Earth itself. The Earth fought back against its own contamination. He recalled the moment when the regulator's gaze had fixed upon him. In that cold, ancient assessment, there was no personal malice, only the preliminary, chilling conclusion that man was another temporary variable, a population to be monitored, measured, and perhaps in a later cycle, corrected. The contamination he had briefly experienced, the intense sensory overload, the quickening of his own form, was merely a sign that his species was capable of change, making it potentially part of the chaotic equation that the regulator existed to solve. The old wisdom persisted, watching as new men arrived centuries later, cutting logging roads and establishing settlements, the first steps toward ecological imbalance. They drove their beat-up Ford pickups, smelling of diesel fuel and damp cedar, convinced they were alone in the wild. Kinota's descendants knew the cycle was not stopped. It was merely delayed. When the human chaos, or the chaos they inadvertently unleashed, reached the critical threshold, the point of no return, the regulator, following its ancient geological mandate, would rise once more from the stone to enforce its terrible order. And that, Kinota knew, would be the brutal, terrifying beginning of the next chapter in the history of the mountain, a chapter where the survivor became the next agent, or the next perfectly evolved target of the chilling permanent balance. The world would always self-correct, and the mechanism would always rise.